I think to start off from the outset, I should mention that I also don't agree about the more terrible slogans. Cue the boards. Obviously, I think is terrible. But I think it's good to have context where the Expropriation Act is coming from. And I think drilling down a little bit, I want to pick your thoughts based on the fact that white South Africans only account for about 10% of the population, and they own about 72% of private land in South Africa. And I think it's always really good also to pretty much draw back a little bit from the historic background behind it. I think it goes back to about 1913, the Native Acts land, which severely, disproportionately discriminate against Black South Africans from owning land in South Africa. And that's what's caused much of the disparity we see economically.
Hey guys, my name is Modi and you are welcome to Modi Speaks. Something keeps bringing me back to this video of Charlie Kirk debating Oxford students, okay? Particularly this part where they debated about the South African Land Expropriation Law of 2024. The conversation is quite interesting, okay? So guys, let's react to the video.
I want to take a back on South Africa. You did talk about South Africa, and obviously the Expropriation Act of 2024 is kind of a really big issue. I think to start off from the outset, I should mention that I also don't agree about the more terrible slogans. Cue the boards. Obviously, I think is terrible. But I think it's good to have context where the Expropriation Act is coming from. And I think drilling down a little bit, I want to pick your thoughts based on the fact that white South Africans only account for about 10% of the population, and they own about 72% of private land in South Africa. And I think it's always really good also to pretty much draw back a little bit from the historic background behind it. I think it goes back to about 1913, the Native Acts land, which severely, disproportionately discriminate against Black South Africans from owning land in South Africa. And that's what's caused much of the disparity we see economically.
So to add a little bit of context to that, most of the land owned by these white South Africans were not handed from the apartheid era, okay? Some of these lands were purchased from Black South Africans by these white South Africans. Also, back in 2008, under the administration of Thabo Mbeki, I think, there was this thing called the Land Restitution Act, which was an act that was implemented to return lands back to South Africans, Black South Africans, who claimed that their lands were forcefully taken away from them during the apartheid regime. Now, many of the Black South Africans claiming land reparations opted to be compensated by cash, okay? They told the government to give them cash instead of land. They collected cash in place of land, and those who took lands ended up selling their lands to white farmers for cash, mainly due to lack of managerial experience. So this is part of the reason why we see a disparity between the percentage of white land ownership and Black land ownership. Of course, the occupation of land by Afrikaners during apartheid played a role in the disparity, but the reasons I mentioned before were also a great factor in this disparity between white and Black land ownership.
So I wanted to find out from you, what are your thoughts? And obviously, Trump administration has really been big on what's going on in South Africa at the minute and the act itself that they enacted. So do you think it's a moral obligation that obviously you're talking about that the land that was expropriated back in the days historically, and that was a colonial endeavor altogether, does that land need to be returned to Black South Africans?
No, but they've already, so I know dangerously little about this. And so, again, what I said on stage is what I know, so I'm going to have to understand. I'm an American. I'm just trying to educate myself on UK politics, and so you will probably know more about this than I will. But is it not true, and you can correct me, in the last 20 years, they've tried some form of reparations with Black South Africans?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that correct? Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, there's been, but it's not worked. So the
BBE, that's right.
So
time out. So taking stuff from one group and giving it to Blacks doesn't work?
Well, it does work, but I'll give you context as well.
Well, you just said it doesn't work.
I'll give you context.
Contradicted yourself, so educate me. I don't know enough, but you just contradicted yourself. You went from it doesn't work to it does work, so please.
I'll give you context as well. So what they did is they did have a program called the Black Empowerment Economic Program. And pretty much what they did is for every corporation, they would have to incorporate Black people within it. But that's not worked really well. And what we've seen over time is that a lot of Black people that have been part of those organizations have only been a minority. So pretty much, as you mentioned, You talked about DEI. So it's just pretty much checking a box, right? You have a black person within the senior management group, but it's only probably 2 people and the like, and that's pretty much it. But the majority of black South Africans that do not own any land, because obviously the historic context that I gave, cannot pretty much be able to earn a good living, because, I mean, with land also comes economic opportunity, and that's been the biggest disparity in South Africa.
Charlie Kirk said he knows a little about this issue, but he was absolutely right about some form of reparations being given to black South Africans as compensation. Beginning in 1995, okay, the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act created a program they called the President's Fund, okay, which was used to make reparations to black South Africans for the sins of apartheid, okay. Each black South African was to be given the amount of 30,000 rands each. That's a lot of money for one person. Now, the funds were made available to the government, even though the government officials decided to pay some black South Africans and kept the remaining money for themselves, okay? Now, that is not the fault of the Afrikaners. Also, in 2008, they had the Land Restitution Act, which I spoke about in the beginning, whereby land was redistributed to black South Africans. Some took it, some sold it, and some demanded for cash instead from the government. Then you also have the BEE program. I think it is short for Black Economic Empowerment, okay? A policy that aims to empower black South Africans and decrease racial economic inequality in South Africa. In the West, you have DEI, and in South Africa, you have BEE, okay? The government mandates every firm, every institution to have a certain racial quota included in their workforce. So BEE is just like DEI, but for South Africans. And also, everybody's pretending like they will automatically become rich once they are given free land, even though some of them who were given land in the past opted to sell it to a white South African and collect the cash instead. But even without selling the land, having a lot of land doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be rich. Also, remember that agriculture is not a big player when it comes to South Africa's GDP. Of course, the very few white farmers are doing a great job and they are feeding the entire nation and even other parts of Africa. But still, agriculture contributes to, I think, 3% of the Southern African GDP. It is not like in Zimbabwe, where 20% of the GDP is dependent on agriculture. So being given people's lands will not necessarily make black South Africans financially stable. And again, when we look at the historical context he gave, which was that the apartheid regime forcefully occupied land previously coveted by the Zulus and the Sothos and the Xhosas of South Africa, I am hard-pressed to ask, does that land actually belong to them? Because this is purely a story of survival of the fittest. This was basically how the world was formed, okay? You go to a new territory, you try to occupy it. If there's no one there originally, then hooray, you're lucky. Finders keepers, it becomes yours. But if there are previous occupants there, you wrestle them for the land. You fight them for the land. If you're stronger, then you rule and make the rules. But if they defeat you, then they rule and carry on. The current story is that the Boers came over with weaponry and occupied these lands, right? However, if you go back further, the same thing happened between different African groups. When the Bantu, the Zulus, the Xhosas arrived in South Africa in the early 500s to 1500s, the land was already inhabited by the Khoi and the San people. Now, the bigger and the stronger nations like the Zulus pushed out the less aggressive Khoi and San people and took over their lands and occupied their country, okay? Currently, the Zulu kingdom is in KwaZulu-Natal, and the Khoi and San people have been pushed into the Kalahari Desert, okay? Think about it. So these guys can dish out the same attitude, but when they now, get the same attitude from some other people, that is the Boers, they can no longer accept it. They can no longer tolerate it. Make it make sense.
And excuse my ignorance on this. From what I understand, though, is that the land owned by black South Africans is actually not as productive as those owned by the Boers. Is that correct?
Well, at the minute, 72% of private land, agricultural land, is owned by white South Africa.
No, I
so
understand
only
that,
a minority.
Fair enough, but the 28%, when compared to Boer-run farms, are actually not as productive because running a farm in South Africa is very difficult.
Yes.
Am I correct by saying that?
Well, context again.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm clear that actually running a farm for over 100 years is actually really impressive.
100%.
Yeah, so we agree on that.
Yes, we agree on that.
So thank you, because I don't know enough about this, but I do think that that's important to note that even the black South Africans that own land, it actually is not as fruitful or has the same yields as those that have been doing it for over 100 years, in a time when there's actually food instability in the region and in South Africa.
But obviously, what I'll say is, I mean, over time, if, say, you did have an act that expropriates land from Black South Africans, you need to build capacity over time. And I think the governors are doing that for the minority of Black people that own agricultural farmland in South Africa, and they've been doing that. But also, we can't deny the fact that if you control supply chains for over a century, right, then it means that you pretty much control the economy, right? So how best do you think, obviously the land was taken from Black people and South Africans, while South Africa has been pretty much, improving the economic outcomes over time, what do you think is the best way to break even in that sense?
The land was not taken from Black people. The natives, who are now referred to as the coloreds, okay, which includes the San and the Khoikhoi people. They look part Asian and part Black, okay? They are the real owners of the land who have lived there for over 150,000 years before the arrival of anyone else. This fact is very, very important. In fact, this point alone should destroy the entire argument of land expropriation without compensation, because the only people who should be getting any form of land expropriation are the Khoisan indigenes and no one else.
Fair question.
And I just want to make one point to you. If obviously you look at key philosophers as well, like Robert Nozick, for instance, he talks about equality in terms of acquisition, as well as the process through which you acquire that land, and obviously correcting the injustice that comes out of it. So what would be your thoughts on that?
I'm not familiar with the philosopher you mentioned. Who was the name again?
Robert Nozick.
Okay.
He's a very prominent philosopher.
I'll look into it. Sure. Thank you for that. I don't know enough about South Africa to suggest anything. Here's what I could tell you, that race-based politics is really bad. I know this because I'm living it in my country. And I think that South Africa should get away from race obsession and should get towards something that is rooted in merit and empowerment. South Africa is what, 75% Black? Is that correct? 80%? Maybe
Yeah,
more?
that's right.
Right. And so explain to me, like post-apartheid, outside of the land ownership, maybe there's a business element. Why is it that once apartheid was removed, why Black South Africans were not able to see their material economic net worth go up in the last 20 or 30 years? What do you think there's any, and maybe I don't know enough, are there any cultural inhibitions of a defeatist attitude that has basically, let's say, infected the minds of poor South Africans last 20 years that feel as if they can't accumulate wealth? Do you think that plays a factor?
Yeah, I think what's really infected Black South Africans is pretty much going back what we're talking about. Obviously, from the colonial background that I just gave you, and we see a lot of like neocolonialism. You control the supply chains, and you own 72% of agricultural farmland. How do you expect the majority Black people to improve their lives and their outcomes when you pretty much control everything?
Enough. And so this is a sloppy but best example I can give. Is that fair? I'll do it. So just grant me some mercy here. What percentage of American land is owned by Asians?
Not sure.
Yeah, less than 3%. They are the richest racial group in America. So maybe land ownership isn't the only thing that matters to get wealthy.
Exactly. I don't know why these guys are so fixated on land, okay? When in fact, land and agriculture contributes just 3% of South Africans' domestic wealth. The Blacks in majority cases don't even have knowledge or experience on how to run a successful farm, okay? So I don't understand the obsession with land unless there is a hidden agenda at play here. Is there a hidden agenda?
Well, I do recognize that a lot of companies now.
Hold on a second. Forget the supply chain, forget the land. Land is basically all owned by white people in America, okay? Yet Asians, Indians are by far the richest group. So why is it that this particular group that happens to own the land and the supply chains, and we've admitted it's very hard to run this land, very hard to run this idea of farming in South Africa, it feels to me, I could be wrong, that it's a group of resentment-driven politics towards a group of people that own land instead of opportunity and empowerment-based politics, talking to the Black majority about how they could build a better life for themselves instead of taking away other people's stuff.
Bam! Now, that is my native tongue, okay? That is Igbo. It is an expression we use when you hit the bull's eye, when you kind of give a mic drop explanation, when you give an undisputed statement, okay? So, bam! That was Charlie's best point for this argument, if you ask me.
Well, maybe the question could be as well, why do you think white South Africans that pretty much acquired that land through unjust means are so apprehensive and they don't really want to break even or probably give up much
Well,
of
that's
the
a
land that was
mindset
stolen.
issue. Hold on, that's a mindset issue. There's plenty in America that gets labeled as quote unquote stolen. Plenty. However, it doesn't necessarily always hold back every ethnic group that is in the country, that is even in the minority of the country. And so I guess the question is, it's a mindset. I don't know South African law enough. I don't know if it's a free market base. I really don't. I'm not just playing cute. But as a general operating principle, it's very bad to build a political movement around taking other people's stuff because you're obsessed with what you don't have instead of the mental energy to create what you want and what you think you deserve. We've seen this with a lot of groups to America. And America is a very interesting petri dish because we have a lot of people that come to our country with nothing. We have Cubans, we have Venezuelans, we have Colombians, we have Persians. And a rule is the group that complains the least and focuses all of their combined cultural energy on creation does really well over multiple years. That might not be possible in South Africa. There might be like no process to create wealth, but I would just venture a guess that market principles transcend borders. So my postulation, and I'm glad you admitted it, don't say kill the Boers. Bad, we should say that. It has created real deaths and real harm. If I was in charge, which of course I'm not, I would spend all my time not saying kill the Boer, kill the Boer. I would say, my people, get your act together. Let's work harder. Let's prove the Boer wrong. Let's start a business. Let's build families. One is driven in resentment and greed and envy and confiscation, and one is rooted in creation and entrepreneurship and optimism. I'd like to see the latter.
Now, to answer that question, okay, I'll refer back to what I said before. Most of these lands owned by the South Africans, white South Africans, were not handed down by the apartheid guilty parents. Most of these Boers purchased these lands with their hard-earned money, mostly from black people. They purchased it from black people who were willing to sell. Most of them acquired these lands on lease. Most of them collected grants from the government, to farm on these lands, okay? And again, who determines who is the thief and who is the owner in this case? The blacks who stole the lands from the Khoisan people, or the whites who did the same to the blacks? Who determines who is the colonizer? If a black tribe invades a territory, it is called migration. It is said to be normal. But if a white person does the same thing, it becomes colonization and stealing of lands. Politics of double standards. I'm not going to play the whole video. You can head over to Charlie's channel to watch the full clip. But I'm going to say this though. This Land Expropriation Act without compensation is one of the hidden plans of the South African government to further marginalize the white population in South Africa. South Africa already has over 140 laws that discriminate actively against white South Africans. Laws supported and implemented by the country. We also have seen the attacks happening, the tactical way by which these Afrikaners are being eliminated. The killings are being covered up as ordinary farm murders, okay? But if it is ordinary, the killers would not go a step further to mutilate the dead victims. In most cases, carve out their private organs, skin them alive, torture them by electrocuting them or incinerating them alive, and other horrible ways. When a president, a sitting president of a country, is chanting that he will cut off the heads of the Boers, that should tell you everything you need to know.
Ulipul sizogoshaya uzotuchulwa ulipul sizogoshaya uzobaleka.
Top powerful political leaders are chanting for the Afrikaners, the Boers, to be exterminated. Millions of supporters are singing alongside him. What does that tell you? I really believe that something deeper is going on here, okay? And this Land Expropriation Act without compensation is another way of slowly driving the white population in South Africa away from South Africa. Anyway, guys, these are my thoughts, these are my opinions, but feel free to share yours in the comment section below, but do so respectfully. Also, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, honestly, I don't know what you're waiting for. Subscribe to the channel. Like and share this video to keep people informed, and consider joining my membership or buy me a coffee if you like, as a way of supporting the channel. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to catch you on the next one. For now, peace.